When I was first learning to meditate, the instruction was to simply pay attention to my breath. And when my mind wandered to bring it back, sounded simple enough. Yet I'd sit on these silent retreats, sweating through t-shirts in the middle of winter. I'd take naps every chance I got because it was really hard work. Actually, it was exhausting. The instruction was simple enough, but I was missing something really important. So why is it so hard to pay attention? Well, studies show that even when we're really trying to pay attention to something like maybe this talk, at some point, about half of us will drift off into a daydream, or have this urge to check our Twitter feed. So what's going on here? It turns out that we're fighting one of the most evolutionarily conserved learning processes currently known in science, one that's conserved back to the most basic nervous systems known to man. This reward-based learning process is called positive and negative reinforcement. And basically it goes like this. We see some food that looks good. Our brain says calorie survival, we eat the food we tasted, it tastes good. And especially with sugar, our body sends a signal to our brain that says, remember what you're eating and where you found it. We lay down this context-dependent memory, and learn to repeat the process next time. See food, eat food, feel good, repeat. Trigger behavior, reward. Simple, right? Well, after a while, our creative brain say you don't want you can use this for more than just remembering where food is. You know, next time you feel bad, why don't you try eating something good? So you'll feel better. We think our brains for the great idea, try this and quickly learned that if we eat chocolate or ice cream when we're mad or sad, we feel better. Same process, just a different trigger. Instead of this hunger signal coming from our stomach, this emotional signal, feeling sad, triggers letters to eat. Maybe in our teenage years, we were a nerd at school. And we see those rebel kids outside smoking, we think, hey, I want to be cool. So we start smoking. The Marlboro Man wasn't a dork. And that was no accident. See cool, smoke to be cool, feel good. Repeat trigger behavior reward. And each time we do this, we learn to repeat the process, and it becomes a habit. So later, feeling stressed out triggers that urge to smoke a cigarette, or to eat something sweet. Now with these same brain processes, we've gone from learning to survive to literally killing ourselves with these habits. Obesity and smoking are among the leading preventable causes of morbidity and mortality in the world. So back to my breath. What if instead of fighting our brains or trying to force ourselves to pay attention, we instead tapped into this natural reward-based learning process? But added a twist? What if instead, we just got really curious about what was happening in our momentary experience? I'll give you an example. In my lab, we studied whether mindfulness training could help people quit smoking. Now, just like trying to force myself to pay attention on my breath, they could try to force themselves to quit smoking. And the majority of them had tried this before and failed, on average, 6 times. Now, with mindfulness training, we dropped the bit about forcing and instead focused on being curious. In fact, we even told them to smoke. What we said, go ahead and smoke. Just be really curious about what it's like when you do and what did they notice. Oh, here's an example from one of our smokers. She said mindful smoking smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck. Now, she knew cognitively that smoking was bad for her. That's why she joined our program. What she discovered just by being curiously aware when she smoked was that smoking tastes like shit. Now, she moved from knowledge to wisdom. She moved from knowing in her head that smoking is bad for her to knowing it in her bones. And the spell of smoking was broken. She started to become disenchanted with her behavior. Now, the prefrontal cortex, that youngest part of our brain from an evolutionary perspective, It understands on an intellectual level that we shouldn't smoke, and it tries its hardest to help us change our behavior, to help us stop smoking, to help us stop eating that second, that it's third, that fourth cookie. We call this cognitive control. We're using cognition to control our behavior. Unfortunately, this is also the first part of our brain that goes offline when we get stressed out, which isn't that helpful. Now we can all relate to this. In our own experience, we're much more likely to do things like yell at our spouse or kids when we're stressed out or tired, even though we know it's not going to be helpful. We just can't help ourselves. Now, when the prefrontal cortex goes offline, we fall back into our old habits, which is why this disenchantment is so important. Seeing what we get from our habits helps us understand them on a deeper level, to know in our own bones, so we don't have to force ourselves to hold back or restrain ourselves from behavior. We're just less interested in doing it in the first place. And this is what mindfulness is all about. Seeing really clearly what we get when we get caught up in our behaviors, becoming disenchanted on a visceral level. And from this disenchanted stance, naturally letting go. This isn't to say that poof, magically we quit smoking. But over time, as we learn to see more and more clearly the results of our actions, we let go of old habits and form new ones. The paradox here is that mindfulness is just about being really interested in getting close and personal with what's actually happening in our bodies and minds from moment to moment. This willingness to turn toward our experience, rather than trying to make unpleasant cravings go away as quickly as possible. And this willingness to turn toward our experience is supported by curiosity, which is naturally rewarding. What does curiosity feel like? It feels good. And what happens when we get curious? We start to notice the cravings are simply made up of body sensations. Oh, there's tightness, there's tension, there's restlessness, and that these body sensations come and go. These are bite-sized pieces of experiences that we can manage from moment to moment, rather than getting clobbered by this huge, scary craving that we choke on. In other words, when we get curious, we step out of our old fear-based reactive habit patterns. And we step into being. We become this inner scientist, where we're eagerly awaiting that next data point. Now, this might sound too simplistic to affect behavior. But in one study, we found that mindfulness training was twice as good as gold standard therapy at helping people quit smoking. So it actually works. And when we studied the brains of experienced meditators, we found that parts of a neural network of self-referential processing called the default mode network were at play. Now, one current hypothesis is that a region of this network called the posterior cingulate cortex is activated, not necessarily by craving itself, but when we get caught up in it, when we get sucked in, and it takes us for a ride. In contrast, when we let go, step out of the process, just by being curiously aware of what's happening, this same brain region quiets down. Now we're testing app and online-based mindfulness training programs that target these core mechanisms. And ironically, use that same technology that's driving us to distraction to help us step out of our unhealthy habit patterns of smoking, of stress eating, and other addictive behaviors. Now remember that bit about context-dependent memory. We can deliver these tools to people's fingertips in the context that matter most. So we can help them tap into their inherent capacity to be curiously aware, right? When that urge to smoke or stress, eat or whatever arises. So if you don't smoke or stress, eat, maybe the next time you feel this urge to check your email when you're bored, or you're trying to distract yourself from work, or maybe to compulsively respond to that text message when you're driving. See if you can tap into this natural capacity. Just be curiously aware of what's happening in your body and mind in that moment. It will just be another chance to perpetuate one of our endless and exhaustive habit loops, or step out of it. Instead of see text message, compulsively text back, feel a little bit better. Notice the urge, get curious, feel the joy of letting go, and repeat. Thank you. Why does your brain prefer cake to broccoli? This seems like a simple solution. Cake tastes better, but it's not as simple as you might think. And the real answer gives us insights into why we act certain ways and how to break bad habits. Ready to dive in? Let's start with why and how our brains form habits. Why is simple habits free up our brain to learn new things? Think about it. If every day you woke up in the morning and had to relearn how to walk, put your clothes on, tie your shoes, make coffee, cook food, and eat, you'd be exhausted before you even finish breakfast. Habits help us learn something once and then we can automatically act that behavior out without thinking. Simple, right? So, how are habits formed? Notice how every single action you take doesn't become a habit. Your brain has to choose what to lay down as a habit and what not to do again. How do we do this? We learn a habit based on how rewarding the behavior is. This is called reward-based learning. And it has three components: a trigger, a behavior, and a reward. Let's say you see your shoelaces untied, that's the trigger. Tie your shoes, that's the behavior, and then don't trip when you walk. That's the reward. The more rewarding a behavior is, the stronger the house. In fact, our brains set up a hierarchy of behaviors based on their reward value to behavior, with the bigger reward is the one we act out. This goes all the way back to our caveman brains that are set up to help us get the most calories we can so we can survive. For example, sugar and fat have lots of calories. So when we eat cake, part of our brain thinks calories survival, so we start to prefer cake over broccoli. Our brains remember which foods are more rewarding. Which is why our parents never served to dessert at the same time as dinner. Given a choice, we'd fill up on cake before we ate our vegetables. But it's not just calories that count. Our brains also learn the reward value of people, of places, and things. For example, think back to all of the birthday parties you went to as a kid. Your brain combines all of that information, the taste of the cake, as well as all the fun you had with your friends, the presents, and the ice cream. Of course, all of this information goes into a single composite reward value. And this reward value gets reinforced with each party we go to. When you are grown up and see a piece of cake, you don't have to relearn what cake tastes like or remember any of the fun from the times you ate it. The association you learned as a kid kicks in, you just know that eating cake makes you feel good. And it triggers that automatic and habitual response to eat it. Think of learning a habit as set and forget, set the reward value and forget about the details. This is also why it's so hard to break bad habits. If you're trying to cut down on automatically eating every piece of cake you see, what is the standard device that you get? Well, use your willpower and just don't eat it. Think of all the calories and what think your way out of eating. This might work sometimes, but more often than not in the long run it fails. Why? That's not how our brains work. To change a behavior, you can't just focus on the behavior itself, you have to address the felt experience of the rewards of the behavior. If it were as easy as thinking our way out of a behavior, we just tell ourselves to stop smoking, stop eating cake, stop yelling at our kids when we're stressed or whatever, and it would work. But it doesn't. The only sustainable way to change a habit is to update its reward value. That's why it's called reward-based learning after all. So how do we update reward values and break bad habits? One simple ingredient: awareness. To change a habit, our brains need new information so they can see that whatever the value that they had learned in the past is outdated. By paying attention to the results of the behavior in the present moment, we can jolt our brain out of habit autopilot and see and feel exactly how rewarding or unrewarding it is for us right now. This new information resets the reward value on that old habit and moves better behaviors into automatic mode. Here's an example. In our Craving Equip program, we don't tell users to force themselves to stop smoking or that smoking is bad for them. They already know that as Instead, we teach people to pay attention when they smoke. Most people start smoking when they're a teenager. So they've laid down a strong reward value for cigarettes, being young and cool at school, rebelling against their parents, all of that. We have them pay attention when they smoke so they can see how rewarding smoking is for them right now. What do they notice? After doing this exercise, someone in our program commented, "Smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals." Yuck! Did you notice how this person paid attention? They weren't thinking, "Oh, smoking's bad for me." They brought awareness to their experience of smoking as they were doing it, noticing the smell and tasting the chemicals in cigarettes. Yes, smoking tastes like crap when we actually pay attention. This kind of awareness helps us reset the reward value in our brain, which in turn helps us break that habit. Kind of awareness really help us change deeply ingrained habits. We wondered the same thing. So we actually did the scientific studies to see for ourselves. In our Eat Right Now program, where people use an app is mindfulness training to learn to pay attention when eating, we built in a craving tool to measure exactly how rewarding certain eating behaviors are. The craving tool has them pay careful attention as they overeat or eat a certain type of food so that their brain can accurately update the reward value. We have found that it takes as few as 10 times of using the craving tool for people to update the reward value of their habitual behaviors and change their habits. In one study of our Eat Right Now program, we saw a 40% reduction in craving-related eating. Just think about this for a moment. This is huge. These studies show that people are no longer habitually reacting to their triggers. They don't have to force themselves to stop, they can move beyond willpower. How are they doing this? They're leveraging their brain strength, the very same processes that set up their old habitual behaviors, to break free from them. Now that you know how your brain actually works, it's time to update your approach to changing habits. Quit relying on willpower and go to the source, reward value. And don't forget, a little awareness goes a long way. So I have a Facebook friend whose life seems perfect. She lives in a gorgeous house. And she has a really rewarding career. And she and her family go on all these exciting adventures together on the weekends. And I swear that they must take a professional photographer along with them. Because no matter where they go, or what they do, the whole family just looks beautiful. And she's always posting about how blessed she is, and how grateful she is for the life that she has. And I get the feeling that she's not just saying those things for the sake of Facebook, but she truly means it. How many of you have a friend kind of like that? And how many of you kind of don't like that person? Sometimes. We all do this, right? It's hard not to do. But that way of thinking costs us something. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, is what our bad habits cost us. Maybe you've scrolled through your Facebook feed, and you think, what if I roll my eyes? It's just 5 seconds of my time? How could it be hurting me? Well, researchers have found that envying your friends on Facebook actually leads to depression. That's just one of the traps that our minds can set for us. Have you ever complained about your boss? Or looked at your friends' lives and thought, why did they have all the luck? Can't help thinking that way? Right? That way of thinking seems small in the moment. In fact, it might even make you feel better in the moment. But that way of thinking is eating away at your mental strength. There's 3 kinds of destructive beliefs that make us less effective and rob us of our mental strength. The first one is unhealthy beliefs about ourselves. We tend to feel sorry for ourselves. And while it's okay to be sad, when something bad happens, self-pity goes beyond that. It's when you start to magnify your misfortune. When you think things like, why did these things always have to happen to me? I shouldn't have to deal with it. That way of thinking keeps you stuck, keeps you focused on the problem, keeps you from finding a solution. And even when you can't create a solution, you can always take steps to make your life or somebody else's life better. But you can't do that when you're busy hosting your own pity party. The second type of destructive belief that holds us back is unhealthy beliefs about others. We think that other people can control us, and we give away our power. But as adults who live in a free country, there's very few things in life that you have to do. So when you say I have to work late, you give away your power. Yeah, maybe there'll be consequences if you don't work late, but it's still a choice. Or when you say my mother-in-law drives me crazy, you give away your power. Maybe she's not the nicest person on earth. But it's up to you how you respond to her because you're in control. The third type of unhealthy belief that holds us back is unhealthy beliefs about the world. We tend to think that the world owes us something. We think if I put in enough hard work, then I deserve success. But expecting success to fall into your lap, like some sort of cosmic reward, will only lead to disappointment. But I know it's hard to give up our bad mental habits. It's hard to get rid of those unhealthy beliefs that we've carried around with us for so long. But you can't afford not to give them up. Because sooner or later, you're going to hit a time in your life where you need all the mental strength that you can muster. When I was 23 years old, I thought I had life all figured out. I graduated from grad school. I landed my first big job as a therapist. I got married, and I even bought a house. And I thought this is going to be great. I've got this incredible jumpstart on success. What could go wrong? That all changed for me one day, when I got a phone call from my sister. She said that her mother was found unresponsive and she'd been taken to the hospital. My husband Lincoln and I jumped in the car and rushed to the hospital. We couldn't imagine what could be wrong. My mother was only 51, shouldn't have it. Any history of have any kind of health problems. When we got to the hospital, doctors explained she'd had a brain aneurysm. And within 24 hours, my mother, who used to wake up in the morning saying, "'T a great day to be alive," passed away. That news was devastating to me. My mother and I had been very close as a therapist, and you want to intellectual level, how to go through grief. But knowing it and doing it can be two very different things. Took a long time before I felt like I was really healing. And then on the 3-year anniversary of my mother's death, some friends called and invited Lincoln and me to a basketball game. Coincidentally, it was being played at the same auditorium. Brett last seen my mother on the night before she passed away. I hadn't been back there since I wasn't even sure I wanted to go back. But Lincoln and I talked about it. And ultimately, we said, maybe that'll be a good way to honor her memory. So we went to the game. We actually had a really good time with our friends. On the drive home that night, we talked about how great it was to finally be able to go back to that place. And remember my mother with a smile, rather than all those feelings of sadness. Shortly after we got home that night, Lincoln said he didn't feel well. A few minutes later, he collapsed. How to call for an ambulance. His family met me at the emergency room. We waited for what seemed like forever, till finally a doctor came out. But rather than taking us out back to see Lincoln, he took us back to a private room, sat us down, and explained to us that Lincoln, who was the most adventurous person I've ever met, was gone. We didn't know at the time, but he'd had a heart attack. He was only 26, he didn't have any history of heart problems. So now I found myself a 26-year-old widow. And I didn't have my mom. How am I gonna get through this? And to describe that as a painful period in my life feels like an understatement. And it was during that time that I realized when you're really going through tough times, good habits aren't enough, only takes 1 or 2 small habits to really hold you back. I worked as hard as I could not just to create good habits in my life, but to get rid of those small habits, no matter how small they might seem. Throughout it all, I held out hope that someday, life could get better. And eventually it did a few years down the road. I met Steve. And we fell in love. And I got remarried. We sold the house that Lincoln and I had lived in and we bought a new house in a new area and I got a new job. But almost as quickly as I breathed in my sigh of relief over that fresh start that I had, we got the news that Steve's dad had terminal cancer. And I started to think, why did these things always have to keep happening? Why do I have to keep losing all my loved ones? This isn't fair. But if I'd learned anything, there was that way of thinking would hold me back. I knew I was going to need as much mental strength as I could muster to get through one more loss. So I sat down and I wrote a list of all the things mentally strong people don't do. And I read over that list. It was a reminder of all of those bad habits that I've done at one time or another that would keep me stuck. And I kept reading that list over and over. And I really needed it because within a few weeks of writing it, Steve's dad passed away. My journey taught me that the secret to being mentally strong is that you have to give up your bad mental habits. Mental strength is a lot like physical strength. If you wanted to be physically strong, you'd need to go to the gym and lift weights. But if you really wanted to see results, you'd also have to give up eating junk food. Mental strength is the same if you want to be mentally strong. You need good habits like practicing gratitude. But you also have to give up bad habits like resenting somebody else's success. No matter how often that happens, it'll hold you back. So how do you train your brain to think differently? How do you give up those bad little habits that you've carried around with you? It starts by countering those unhealthy beliefs that I talked about with healthier ones. For example, unhealthy beliefs about ourselves mostly come about because we're uncomfortable with our feelings. Feeling sad or hurt or angry or scared, those things are all uncomfortable. We go to great lengths to avoid that discomfort. We try to escape it by doing things like hosting a pity party. And although that's a temporary distraction and just prolongs the pain, the only way to get through uncomfortable emotions, the only way to deal with them is that you have to go through them, to let yourself feel sad, and then move on, to gain confidence in your ability to deal with that discomfort. Unhealthy beliefs about others come about because we compare ourselves to other people. We think that they're either above us or below us. Or we think that they can control how we feel or that we can control how they behave. Or we blame them for holding us back. But really, it's our own choices that do that. You have to accept that you're your own person and other people are separate from you. The only person you should compare yourself to is the person that you were yesterday. And unhealthy beliefs about the world come about because deep down, we want the world to be fair. We don't want to think that if we put in enough good deeds, and if good things will happen to us, or if we tough it out through enough bad times, we'll get some sort of reward. But ultimately, you have to accept that life isn't fair. And that can be liberating. That means you won't necessarily be rewarded for your goodness. But it also means no matter how much you've suffered, you're not doomed to keep suffering. The world doesn't work that way. Your world is what you make it. But of course, before you can change your world, you have to believe that you can change it. I once worked with this man who had been diabetic for years. His doctor referred him to therapy because he had some bad mental habits that were starting to affect his physical health. His mother had died from complications of diabetes at a young age. So he just believed he was doomed. And he'd given up trying to manage his blood sugar altogether. In fact, his blood sugar had gotten so high lately that it was starting to affect his vision. And he had his driver's license taken away. And his world was shrinking. When he came into my office, it was clear he knew all the things he could do to manage his blood sugar. He just didn't think it was worth the effort. But eventually, he agreed to make one small change. He said, "I'll give up my 2-liter-a-day Pepsi habit. And I'll trade it in for Diet Pepsi." And he couldn't believe how quickly his numbers started to improve. And even though he came in every week to remind me how horrible Diet Pepsi tasted, he stuck with it. Once he started to see a little bit of improvement, maybe I could look at some of my other habits. And he said I could trade in my nightly bowl of ice cream for a snack with a little less sugar. And then one day he was at a thrift store with some friends. And he found this beat-up old exercise bike. He bought it for a couple of bucks. And he brought it home and he parked it in front of his TV. And he started to pedal while he'd watched some of his favorite shows every night. And not only did he lose weight, but one day he noticed he could see the TV just a little bit more clearly than he had before. And suddenly it occurred to him. Maybe the damage done to his eyesight wasn't permanent. So he set a new goal for himself to get his driver's license back. And from that day forward, he was on fire. By the end of our time together, he was coming in every week saying, "Okay, what are we going to do this week?" Because he finally believed that he could change his world and that he had the mental strength to change it. And that he could give up his bad mental habits. And it all started with just one small step. So I invite you to consider what bad mental habits are holding you back. What unhealthy beliefs are keeping you from being as mentally strong as you could be? And what's one small step that you could take today? Right here, right now. Thank you. Let me tell you about my mom. My mom was 42 years old when I was born. And she started exercising for the first time in her life. She started by running around the block. And then she started doing 5K races. And then she started doing 10K races. And after that, she ran a marathon. And after that, my mom did a triathlon. By the time she was 57 years old, my mom was trekking uphill to the base camp of Mount Everest. And let me tell you about my dad. When I was a kid, my dad used to take me to science classes. He was also my calculus teacher. In high school, I wanted to crawl under the desk. I learned something important from my mom, the value of health. And I learned something important from my dad, the value of science. And these two values have guided me on my trek through life. And they've helped me appreciate an epidemic that we are all facing. And it's not Ebola. Instead, it is the epidemic of unhealthy living. 500 million people worldwide are obese. And you would think that 50 years after the first U.S. Surgeon General's report on the dangers of tobacco was published, that we'd be beyond the problem of smoking. Today, 1 billion people worldwide use tobacco, and obesity are two of the most preventable causes of premature death. Solving these problems, it's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle. We engage in unhealthy behaviors because of our genetics, because of brain neurotransmitters, because of environmental influences, such as peers and the media. Each of those pieces of the puzzle are not things that you and I can solve on our own. But there is one piece of this puzzle that may hold the key. Our choices about what we do with our cravings to engage in addictive behaviors like smoking or in overeating. Our choices, there is a new science of self-control that may hold the key to reversing these epidemics. It's called willingness. Willingness means allowing your cravings to come and to go while not acting on them by smoking or eating unhealthy. But actually, I'm not talking about willpower, and I'm not talking about power through your cravings. Instead, I'm talking about a different notion of cravings. That looks like this. Dropping the struggle with your cravings, opening up to them, letting them be there and making peace with them. Now at this point, you may be very skeptical. When I first heard about it years ago, a friend of mine came to me with a book on willingness. He said, "Jonathan, this book will change your life forever." And I said, "Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll check it out." So I went through it, and now it's a bunch of psychobabble, toss it aside, until some years later, when my wife brought me to a workshop on willingness at the University of Washington. And I was blown away. So then I read the book. And then I read a lot of books on willingness, and I got trained in it. And what I learned was that willingness is part of acceptance in the acceptance and commitment therapy approach to behavior change. It's a broad approach to behavior change that's being used to help people with anxiety disorders with addictions. Even some innovative companies are now using it to help improve their employees' performance and reduce their stress. Now, to understand why I was blown away, you have to understand the world that I live in. In my research world, a common way you help people quit smoking and lose weight is you teach them to avoid their cravings. Avoid thinking about smoking, distract yourself from food cravings. There's a song from a Broadway show that captures this perfectly. It goes like this. When you start to get confused because of thoughts in your head, don't feel those feelings, hold them mute, and instead turn it off, like a light switch, just go click. We do it all the time, when you're feeling certain feelings that just don't seem right. Treat those pesky feelings like a reading light and turn them off. We all live in this world where the song we keep hearing is turn off the bad feelings. Now, let's take a look at these cookies. They just came out of the oven. Oh, they are so good. They're so delicious. Just feel that craving to eat those cookies. They're lovely. They're so good. Now, turn it off. Turn it off. You want those cookies even more now? Right? You see the futility of trying to turn it off, you can't turn it off. And maybe you don't have to. Maybe you can leave the light on. Here is how my research lab at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center here in Seattle is conducting randomized clinical trials to see if showing people how to be willing to have their cravings is effective for quitting smoking. We are conducting trials and face-to-face interventions in a telephone quit smoking hotline and a website called webquit.org. And an app called Smart Quit. These technologies have the potential to reach millions of people with interventions that could save their lives. That's pretty amazing. And let me tell you about the data. When you pull together the results from 6 clinical trials, all 6 that have been published to date, including trials conducted by our colleagues, what we see is that for the people who were assigned to the avoidance approach, avoiding your cravings, some of them quit smoking. And it varied depending on the study. However, for the people who were randomly assigned to the willingness condition, twice as many quit smoking. Very, very encouraging. Now, of course, the data only tells us one small part of the story. So to help you see willingness in action, I'm going to weave together experiences I've had in counseling people for quitting smoking, and altogether refer to them as one person that we'll just call Jane. So as is typical of people who come in to want help for quitting smoking, Jane was a 45-year-old person who started smoking when she was a teenager. She tried to quit smoking several times, was not successful. So she was very skeptical that anything new was going to be helpful to her for quitting. And yet she was really hopeful that this time would be different. So the first thing that I showed Jane was to be willing, that is to be aware of her cravings in her body, so to notice where she felt cravings in her body. And when I did this, I asked her to journal that and just to track the intensity over time, and see if she'd smoke afterwards. So the middle of explaining that, she stops me and she says, "What are you talking about? I don't have cravings. I just smoke." So I said, "Well, why don't you try it? And we'll see what happens. And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else." So she came back a week later, and she said, "I've been tracking my cravings. I've been tracking them all the time. And now, I can't stop thinking about smoking. What am I supposed to do?" Well, before I tell you my answer, let's look behind the scenes. Now, what was probably going on here was that Jane was having cravings all along. And like a lot of us, she was living on autopilot. You wake up in the morning, you smoke a cigarette, you have a cup of coffee, you smoke a cigarette, you get in the car, you smoke a cigarette. We're often just not aware of what we think and what we feel before we act. So my answer to Jane was to be willing. And one of the ways I showed her to do that was with an exercise called I Am Having the Thought. So one of Jane's thoughts before she had a cigarette was, I'm feeling a lot of stress right now, I really need a cigarette. So I asked her to add the phrase, I'm having the thought, like this, I'm having the thought that I'm feeling a lot of stress right now, I really need a cigarette. Then I asked her to add the phrase, I'm noticing I'm having the thought. So I'm noticing that I'm having the thought done feeling a lot of stress right now, I really need a cigarette. Now, we can all do an exercise like this, when we have any kind of negative thought, like for my thought that I'm boring all of you with my talk. And I'm having the thought that I'm boring all of you with my talk. So what this exercise did is it gave me a little bit of space between me and my thoughts. And it's in that space that I can choose not to run off the stage in front of 1,500 people. And the fact is, we don't act on every thought we had, because if we did, we'd all be in a whole lot of trouble. So this was helpful to Jane. But there was something else that was really difficult for Jane, and I felt a lot of compassion for her about it. And that was the judgment that she felt from people when she would be outside smoking a cigarette. The criticism from her husband for being a smoker, and the self-loathing that she developed about smoking. And she dealt with his shame by having a cigarette, which gave her relief temporarily until the shame came back. So I said to Jane, what would it be like if we tried to honor this feeling of shame as part of the human experience? If you had a close friend who was feeling shame about smoking, I said to Jane, what would you offer this friend as words of caring and kindness? And could you then offer those words to yourself, Jane? And she looked up. And she had this look of this temporary respite from the shame, which made it just a little bit easier next time not to act on the craving. So here's the secret to self-control. The secret to self-control is to give up control. Because otherwise, we get into a tug of war with a monster, a craving monster. And the craving monster says, come on, smoke cigarette. Come on, have that cookie, come on. And you're on the other side saying, no, critic monster, I'm going to distract myself from you. I'm going to ignore you. No, 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 no. Craving monster says, yeah, no, come on, you know you want it. And you're just back here and you're going back and forth and back and forth. And pretty soon, the craving monster overpowers you, you have the cookie, you have that cigarette until the craving monster comes back. And then you're in the tug of war again, doing what we've learned how to do and less, you've dropped the rope. And what you discover is, if you just allow the monster to occupy a space in your body, you discover in a few minutes that the craving monster is not as threatening as he appears. And sometimes he even goes away. As we break for lunch, we're going to have choices of what to eat. When you see them, try to be aware of the cravings in your body. Try to be willing to have those cravings, see if they pass on their own. And whatever choice you make, try to bring a spirit of caring and kindness to yourself. For that is the mountain that we are all climbing. Thank you very much. In my past life as a soccer coach, once you win a national championship, everybody wants to come play for you. Really not true. Once you pay them $25,000 a year in scholarships, everybody wants to compete for you. And parents would always come to me and they'd say, okay, my son or my daughter wants to come play at your university. What is it that we have to do? You know, what are you looking for? And being the Socratic professor that I am well as well, what does your son or daughter do? What did they do really well, that we'd be interested in? And typically their answers are, well, they've got great vision, they're really good, they can see the entire field, or my daughter is the fastest player, there's nobody that can beat her, or my son's got a great left foot, or really, really great in the air and can hit every ball. Like, not bad. But to be quite honest with you, those are the last things I'm looking for. The most important thing, self-confidence, without that skill, and I use the word skill intentionally. Without that skill, we are useless as a soccer player. Because when you lose sight or belief in yourself, we're done for. I use the definition of self-confidence to be the ability or the belief to believe in yourself to accomplish any task, no matter the odds, no matter the difficulty, no matter the adversity, the belief that you can accomplish it. Self-confidence, some of you're saying are great, I don't have it. I'm so shy out that when I'll never do it, I'm gonna. And you start to drag all the way down here, her. But I use the word skill, because I believe it can be trained. And I'll show you a couple of ways which we do. Hopefully, I won't run out of time. I don't use any slides, because my speech always goes here, here, here. So we'll see which way we get to the easiest way to build self-confidence. There's no magic button. I can't say this plane is going down. Who can fly it? Put your hand up. I can. I'm confident. Repetition, 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 right. What does Malcolm Gladwell call it? The 10,000-hour rule? There's no magic button. I recruited a goalie from Colombia, South America one year, big tall, 6'3" man. You know, he had hands like stone. I thought he was like Flipper. Every time I throw him the ball down onto the ground, I was like, oh my God, we're in trouble. Simple solution: get to the wall, kick a ball against the wall and catch it, kick the ball against the wall and catch it. His goal was 350 a day for 8 months. He came back. His hands were calloused, the moisture on his hands were literally gone. He is now playing in Europe. Magic, no repetition, repetition, repetition. The problem is we expect to be self-confident. But we can't be unless the skill or the task we're doing is not novel, is not new to us. We want to be in a situation where we've had so much pressure in that. And what I mean, because pressure builds diamonds, we want to be in a situation where, hey, I've done this 1,000 times. I did my speech I practice in front of the mirror. Hey, I'm sounding good. And then I read in front of my kids and my wife was like, oh my gosh, got a little nervous. Then you get in front of Glenn Cool. Oh my goodness, I'm a little more nervous. By the time I get to the ACG where 2,500 people can't see anymore, right? 2,500 people where 2,500 people are there. I won't have a single ounce of nervousness because of my ability to practice. Right, over and over and over again. The problem with repetition is, well, how many of us bail after the first bit of failure? How many of us bail after the first bit of adversity? Edison was on that video? And depends who you ask. There's anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 tries to build that light bulb. 1,000 to 10,000 J.K. Rowling should be on that video. You want me to publish her? She took her Harry Potter book too. I believe the number was 12 or 13. I'm pretty confident, but after 2 or 3 no's, I'd be like, dang it, after 6 or 7. I'm like, maybe not. Definitely after 9 or 10 I'd be looking to be a soccer coach or something else beside an author. Right? I mean, 12 times somebody said no. But practice, 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 and do not accept failure. Maybe it shouldn't be repetition. Maybe the answer should be persistence. Because we all repeat something, but very few of us really will persist. So that's one way to build self-confidence. Get out there. Do what you want to do and do not accept no. The other one is self-talk. We all have a self-talk tape that plays in our head. Anybody goes shopping and put on a pair of pants this week? If you're a woman, the first thing that always comes down, I look fat, nice pants. And if you're a man, it's the opposite. Oh God, I have no muscle. I'm so flabby. Right? We all have this tape that plays in our head as a student. If they asked me the question, it was like, oh, please professor, don't pick me. I don't know the answer. I don't, but I look down. Right, if you're in a one, I let me tell you something, and the VP of Business Administration, I shouldn't repeat this. But when they hired me as an athletic director, I sat in an architect's meeting. And I am as bold as dumb as a post when it comes to anything to do with numbers and angles. And they're like the fungible, later valve of the architectural. They're there. What do you think, Dr. Joseph? Let me look into that for you and get back to you. Right. I was thinking, oh, God, oh, please don't ask me. Please don't ask me. We all have this negative self-talk that goes in our head. Guess what? There's enough people that are telling us we can't do it, that we're not good enough. Why do we want to tell ourselves that we know for a fact that thoughts influence actions? We sat there with the video, Sheldon Dr. Levy showed. Right? We know that our thoughts influence actions. Why do we want to say that negative self-talk to ourselves? We need to get our own self-affirmations. Muhammad Ali, what was his self-affirmation? I am the greatest. Who else is going to tell you? There's need to be quiet moments in your bedroom, quiet moments when you're brushing your teeth, that we need to reaffirm. I am the captain of my ship and the master of my fate. That is my affirmation. I came from a school of 1,000 people. I lived in a town of 1,000 people for 15 years. There is no reason that I shouldn't be in charge of an athletic department building maple leaf gardens. But I am the captain of my ship and the master of my fate. If I don't say it, if I don't believe it, no one else will. How do you build self-confidence? Get away from the people who will tear you down. There's enough of that. Muhammad Ali, I am the greatest. There is no one better than me. It's a difference between hubris and ego and false pride. It's just reminding yourself in quiet, silent moments. I put it down on the list. It's right beside my mirror. Write about all the things that make me who I am. Because I make enough mistakes. And the newspapers will recognize it. And people around me will recognize it and they'll tear me down. And pretty soon I'll begin to believe it. There was a time when my confidence was really low. There was a time when I took this job when I came from Iowa. I don't know if I could do it. I had to bring out my self-confidence letter. A letter I wrote to myself when I was feeling good. I haven't congratulations on getting your PhD before 40. Congratulate, I am 40. Under congratulations on winning a national championship. Good job on raising 3 good kids and marrying the right woman. I wrote a letter to myself. It was my own brag sheet, my own letter about the things I was proud of. Because there are moments, and we'll all experience them in our career, in our life, and our job hunting and our relationships, when we are not feeling good about who and what and where we are. And I had to bring out that letter and read it time and time again for a period of about 2 weeks to weather me through that storm. It was important. Stop the self-talk. The negative self-talk. If you'll watch, you'll see some athletes, they'll have a little bandage or a little Brett brand around them. Lance Armstrong is a perfect one. What's his self-affirmation? Livestrong isn't a brand. It was to remind him of who he was, livestrong, then it came a brand. He would move that from one arm to the next arm when doubt and fear came into his mind. Let's strong. Put it on there. Let's go. We'll all have it. Replace it. 2 ways to build a self-confidence. Worried about my time? I'm going to tell you a one way that you can build self-confidence in others. We are coaches and educators. We are teachers. We are people who will create value in the world. And in doing that, we are critical by the nature of what we do. I'm a coach. I want you to score a goal. Baldwin over high, Dan hit the ball when high, thank you coach. I know that feedback tells me that. So what do we do? I need you to put your elbow, or here I need you to put your knee over the ball, I need to follow through. Boom lan. Great. Notice I never made it as a professional. What can we do? We fix mistakes when I'm fixing that mistake, Johnny. This is terrible. You need to bend your knee, you need to do this. What have I done to Johnny's self-confidence? Bend your knee thinking this through. This next thing you know, Johnny's crushed. Ignore what Johnny does wrong and find Bob or Sally or Frida over here. Great goal. Frida. I loved how you kept your knee low. You follow through and you landed like this. Great job, Johnny. Great. Johnny's not demoralized. His confidence isn't shot. And what I've done is I built up freedom. Imagine how we could change the way we parented kids. Instead of get that glass off the counter, what's wrong with you? If we catch them while they're good, great job, great job. Thank you, Alice, for taking your glass to the counter. It sounds simple, but we forget about it, or as educators or somebody as a team, if we manage to praise the positive behavior that we wanted to reinforce, we forget it sounds so simple, catch them when they're good. We forget it. It's simple. Here's what they did. There was a study in Kansas that did this. They did video, and we all do video. And we showed the video of them during the run of the play. This goal happened because the basket wasn't protected. We didn't rotate here, right? We needed to do this and then cover the slot. And if that's the baseline improvement of the Kansas State team went like this. Then they said they ignored all of that. And they just showed them the times they did it right. The times they did it perfect that presented no goals spoke to the same points, improvement went like that. It changed and revolutionized the way we as coaches interact with our student athletes. We can apply that to the business world, we can apply that to our student group works, we can apply that to our management teams, easily. Catch them when they're good. Last and certainly not least, my son is really good at this. Self-confident people interpret feedback the way they choose to. I asked my son who was by the fire, terrible athlete, gets it from his dad. Games, they went fine. How's the game? Oh, great. I scored 3 goals. I got 2 assists. I'm like, I did not see him touch the puck. But he has his own perception of how he did. I love it. Right. I'm that guy. I'm like, I remember when I was taking my there's like when I met my wife is in the comments. Polly, would you like to go to the movies, ladies? And she goes, no. I asked her again. Because I think that she just hasn't seen me in the right light. Maybe that's not the wrong shirt on, right? Because I'm interpreting that the way I want to interpret it. Finally, I asked her what again, she gives me this one comment right there. She sent it to her friend because that's what you did back then. She wouldn't update you unless it was the last person on Earth that hell was freezing over. There was a small chance we had to save the planet Earth. Somebody was like, there's no chance. I'm like, you're saying there's a chance. Right? Because that's how I'm going to interpret it. If I could give you one thing to take from this, it is no one will believe in you unless you do. Listen to the words of that video. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers. The round pegs in the square holes. We're supposed to be different folks. And when people look at us, believe in yourself. Thank you.